probably only 5% of the time you are driving in those conditions, and they're always variable. Might be a little bit more rain, a little bit less rain, whereas when it's dry, it's always pretty similar. So you've got to be on your toes, you've got to be very dynamic and adaptable in those wet conditions. In Formula 1 we talk about the ambient temperature, but also the track temperature quite a lot. So firstly, with the track temperature, that has a drastic effect on the tyres. So if you're driving on a surface that's nice and cool, the tyres are effectively almost cooling down every time you go down the straight. Whereas if that circuit is roasting hot, you're basically driving on top of a saucepan almost, and that's heating the tyres. It doesn't offer you as much grip, and that's directly related to sunlight. So if it's a cloudy day, even though it may be hot, the track temperature drops. If it's day or night, so the night races, the track temperature is always lower for those obvious reasons. But also the colour of the tarmac, you may visibly see some tracks are a bit grayer versus some circuits that are very black tarmacs, and that obviously attracts the heat and gives you a hotter temperature, which makes it always a bit trickier for the tyres. So track temperature directly related to the tyres, but then ambient temperature has an effect on many things. Firstly, the driver, you're getting pretty hot and toasty in the car, engine, fuel, brakes, everything's just struggling a bit more. The ambient's more related to those factors.
The ambient temperatures have a pretty big impact on car performance. Obviously we have a lot of hardware that's being driven very hard. Part of optimising the whole aerodynamic package of the car is that we don't want to just be taking airflow to cool things, because we're wasting that airflow effectively.
It's a little bit like a kind of Goldilocks situation where too hot and too cold can cause a problem for them. It needs to be just right to get the best performance. And so for strategists, we're looking out for how close we are to some of those tipping points in terms of things getting too hot and the degradation accelerating, or things getting too cold and the tyres falling apart from that perspective.
Really the optimum is getting the car right on temperature limit when the drivers are pushing as hard as they possibly can.
In terms of the temperature within the car, the things we're managing, again, that's very dynamic. It depends on the situation we find ourselves in, whether the tyres are overheating or the power unit's overheating. Sometimes in a perfect scenario, everything's right on the limit, you don't have to manage anything and you're driving flat out. But often, if you make the car with too much cooling, you're not optimising the aerodynamical performance. So you can't just give it the maximum amount of cooling for the brakes, the maximum amount of cooling for the power unit, because that means you have to have a big, wide, fat bodywork to really cool down the car, and then you lose in performance. So you've got to strike that balance.
So Montreal typically can be quite difficult for cooling the car. Sometimes it's quite hot there, which can be a challenge for the engines, but actually more so it's over the years been quite a problem for brakes. Because of the aerodynamic characteristics, we try and not run too much brake cooling, but because it's got a lot of long straights, you're reaching very high speeds, and then all the corners are very low speed, so there's a lot of braking, a lot of heavy braking, which means keeping the brakes cool can be quite challenging. Another aspect of cooling is actually considering the driver. These days they're incredibly crammed into these cockpits, and because of the packaging they have a lot of hot electronics boxes, hot pipework around them, and again we don't really want to spend a lot of airflow cooling them down because it takes away from other performance aspects. But equally we do have to accept that in some of the hotter races not keeping them cool is a human performance factor, and it can be a huge distraction because they're working really hard in the car, and obviously if they're overheating they're not able to concentrate to their best ability to get the most out of the car themselves.
In terms of climatic conditions, initially it's all about historical data. We start really paying attention to the forecast about a week out from the event, because that's when it's really accurate enough to start factoring into our preparation.
The main differences between driving in the dry and driving in the wet, I mean, firstly is just the visibility and rain and water being on the track, which makes it incredibly slippery. It's very easy in the wet conditions to make a mistake. And also because it doesn't rain that often during a Formula 1 season, you don't get that many laps and that much experience in the wet. So we probably do 95% of the season in the dry. Probably only 5% of the time you are driving in those conditions, and they're always variable. Might be a little bit more rain, a little bit less rain. Whereas when it's dry, it's always pretty similar. So you've got to be on your toes, you've got to be very dynamic and adaptable in those wet conditions.
That period of intermediate conditions as the dry line is forming is incredibly tense, but it's also incredibly exciting. It can be the moment that makes or breaks your race, so it's really important to be working very closely together across the strategy, engineering and driver team. Who makes the decision it really depends on the race. If you've got nothing to lose, then you'll often be looking to be quite aggressive with that transition, at which point the driver is a key decision maker. Really, he's the only one who knows how it feels and whether it will be safe to risk going to slicks. On the other hand, if you've got things to lose, then you're unlikely to be the first car to go and take that risk. So then the strategy team have a much bigger impact on the decision, because we can see all the data coming in. We can see the GPS on how the drivers who have transitioned are getting on, and often we can make that call with more information than the driver, so they will be led by us.
When it's into conditions going to slicks onto the dry tyre, you're looking for that dry line on the track. So we as racing drivers tend to drive on the same racing line, and that's where it dries the track. Because of the speed we go in, it lifts the water off the track, and the heat from the car and the rubber sort of evaporates the water. So you're looking for that dry line, but then you're looking if it's dry throughout the whole track, because it may be dry on 75% of the track, but if that quarter of the circuit is still very, very wet, if you're on the dry tyres, you probably won't even be able to get around the corner. So it's very tricky. It may be slicks on half of the track or 3/4 of the track, but it's that wettest point on the circuit which dictates when you can make that transition. The perfect weather conditions don't exist for a driver. Whatever we are fastest in on the day are the perfect conditions, and I think sometimes that's in wet conditions, sometimes everything's working well when it's hot and sunny, or dry and cold and a bit misty, so it's only perfect when you're winning.